We've got absolutely record high levels of immigration in the UK right now, both legal and illegal immigration. And this, again, you see a massive class divide. The people who are managing immigration, the people who are pushing for high levels of immigration, you often find that they live in nice parts of cities where immigrants rarely appear, other than, the nanny who's going to help look after the children, or the electrician or decorator who's going to help maintain the house. Whereas it's working class people who are more at the bottom of the economic pecking order, who not only have their wages artificially deflated, not only have their jobs put at risk, because cheaper people come in and take the work from them, but actually find that it's their culture and their communities and their neighbourhoods that are most at the forefront of change as well.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. In 2024, Western society seemed to be positioned like Schrodinger's cat, simultaneously alive and dead as they are at once free and repressive. Is the West falling under the weight of welfare states and identity politics? Is a society that allows one to invent their gender and requires everyone else to formally acknowledge that invention just as the inventor does, is that society really free? Have liberty and libertine been conflated in the same way that equality and equity have? If so, can any of it be unwound? In this election year, as claims are made by all sides as to who represents the true vanguard of democracy, who and what are the real threats to pluralism? Which are the meaningful divides in popular opinion, and under what circumstances can people on both sides of those divides coexist peacefully? Big questions to tackle in advance of big choices to come. To help us process both, we're pleased to be joined by Joanna Williams, the founder of CO, a Britain-based independent think tank that publishes original essays, reports, and analysis designed to celebrate humanity's potential. Ms. Williams is also a weekly columnist for the online magazine Spiked and writes regularly for numerous other publications, including The Times, The Spectator, The Telegraph, and The Daily Mail. She previously worked at the University of Kent as its director of the Center for the Study of Higher Education. And most recently, she worked as the head of education and culture at Policy Exchange. She's the author of numerous books, including How Woke Was Won. Joanna Williams, thanks for joining us on Counterculture. Welcome.
It's a real pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with How Woke Was Won, because that book you penned is less than 2 years old. And it seems to me there's still a wide swath of populations in the Western world that are trying to reconcile how we got here. They've seen cancel culture at work for a couple of years now, at least, if they've just been paying recent attention. Obviously, they've seen some of the bad behavior and bad actors that populate the elite institutions, starting with, for example, the Ivy League. But I think there's still a lot of people wrestling with just exactly how we got here. And there's a few different explanations and a few differences of opinion among academics and scholars in terms of how far we need to go back to understand how we got to the place we are today. So give us your synopsis of how we got to this place, and then we can talk about maybe some things we can do about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really good question, and I think you're absolutely right to say that we need to go back quite far to truly understand the origins of where we're at today. Personally, I think we need to go back to at least the 1960s, if not the immediate post-Second World War era. It seems to me that that was a time when there was a real crisis of confidence in Western society. Having won a war, we were left uncertain as to what we actually stood for. Particularly within academia at this time, you can see that there's lots of trends towards questioning. For example, what does a canon of literature actually mean? And really the beginnings of deriding Western society from within Western society. And I think one of the problems with that process is that it actually left the door open for people with quite destructive ideologies to come marching into our institutions and really kind of reclaim or claim them for themselves and put in their own sense of purpose and their own sense of what they thought society should be like. And I think really the history of the past 60 years has been the playing out of this process. I think there's a lengthy history to this, and in particular the history of the past 60 years is really that of a growing disjuncture between kind of elite, professional, managerial class and their particular ideology, their particular concerns and the way that they look at the world and the way they understand how society operates. And the rest of us, basically, who become the unwitting victims of their divisive approach.
Right, but you talk about how people with sort of dangerous, illiberal ideologies and ideas gain control of these cultural and civic institutions. But I still think people are having trouble understanding, well, how did that happen? I mean, these are educated people, these are powerful people, in some cases very wealthy people. How all of a sudden do you have outside agitators take over a university, take over a Fortune 500 company, take over a K through 12 school system? How does that just happen?
No, I think it's a really great question, and I do think it is quite difficult to understand on the surface because rationally it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But again, I come back to the point I was making earlier about the post-war period and a real crisis of purpose. Because to me, the role of a Fortune 500 company should be to make money. That's the goal of capitalism. It seems to me the goal of a school should be to educate children. In the UK, we have a misfortune to be burdened with the National Health Service. To me, the role of a hospital should be curing the sick, making people get better. But it just seems to me the case that in every single institution you care to mention, whether that's in the private sector or the public sector, there's been a fundamental crisis of purpose where the goal of a school, it's no longer enough to educate children or educating children hardly plays any part in that purpose anymore. The goal of capitalists is no longer to make money. The goal of a hospital is no longer to cure the sick. And because we've got this crisis of purpose where what I think institutions should be doing is no longer considered enough, all these other political purposes around kind of diversity, equity and inclusion, most famously now, sweep into the institutions and kind of become the purpose of what that institution's all about. So again, to use the kind of Fortune 500, it seems that capitalists are embarrassed to say that they like making money, or that's their goal, is to make money nowadays. Go back 100 years, 150 years, people would have been proud to say that. There would have been no shame in saying you wanted to make lots of money. In fact, it could be seen as quite a socially noble thing to do. If you look at the likes of Rockefeller, money could be put into funding big public institutions and you could be proud to have made that money. But now you've got this crisis where people can't say that. Coca-Cola want to say, oh, well, we support Black Lives Matter and kind of pretend that that's their main purpose. Nike want to say that they, promote gender equality or promote body positivity rather than just saying we want to sell lots of trainers and make lots of money.
Yeah, but it's funny because what you just said before, that pretend, it's a fraud. And I think people realize it's a fraud. And also in terms of how we actually interact with one another in the real world on a daily basis, there is still a lot of prestige and power that comes with having money. So, I mean, it's it's sort of this kabuki theater that we're doing where we're pretending we don't value the things we value, and we're pretending we're not here to do the things that we're here to do.
You see, I wish it was a fraud, and if it was a fraud, I think it would be a lot easier for us to challenge and take up. My fear is that these people do actually believe the rhetoric they put out there. The executives of Nike really do believe that they're on a mission to promote racial equality. The executives of Netflix or, name any other company you like, they really do believe that their goal is to create, transgender, Bud Light, for example, really do believe that part of their goal is to create a kind of acceptance for transgender people. I think they really do believe this as a moral mission, and I think we have to take it seriously. But I think more to the point, these beliefs have kind of become so institutionalized that they are the way that capitalism operates nowadays. The vast amounts of paperwork that are generated, and it's these values that people buy into that lend legitimacy between one capitalist company and another. I mean, another way of looking at this is that the whole equality, diversity, equity, inclusion, whatever framework, this, you could say, well, this is just a gloss. This is just what companies do to look nice. But I think it's far more sinister. It's the way that they control their workforce nowadays. It's the way that they control their employees. So, when I had my first few jobs as a teenager in my early 20s, you had kind of a clocking on and clocking off machine. And it was very obvious to me that what I was selling was my time, my labor, as I worked in restaurants and waitressing. Now, with all the EDI training, what you're selling is almost your soul. You're with unconscious bias training, for example. Employers have unprecedented insight into your unconscious mind. Now that terrifies me, but it gives employers huge control over their labor. And I think they are not daft. They appreciate that. They can sound all nice and fuzzy to the outside world. Equity, diversity, inclusion, who doesn't like that? Meanwhile, they have more power than ever before.
I want to read something to you from Shelby Steele, who's one of my North Stars when we talk about some of this identity politics stuff. He was asked the question in a recent interview he gave to City Journal. What is evil? What's evil? And Shelby Steele said this: to me, it's one word: convenience. I don't think most people would associate convenience as synonymous with evil or a manifestation of it. But let me go on and get your reaction. People defend things like affirmative action under the rationale of diversity. So we're going to lower standards for blacks and not admit as many Asians. Racists constantly use in the name of the good in the act of committing racism. And we're saying such racism is inclusiveness. How insidious evil is. You're saying this person gets into school and this person doesn't because of the color of their skin, and that is diversity, that is inclusiveness? It's just a convenient way for you to get the innocence and moral authority that gives you power. It's a hell of a problem in a huge, complex society like America. Evil is everywhere, waiting around the corner, advocating for itself as a moral convenience that will make you a better person. And in this sense, evil fascinates me. It's always ironic. It's sweetly insidious. And I guess that's what I was talking about, sort of referencing when I mentioned that so much of this seems to me performative, that this is moral convenience to protect the prestige, the status, the sinecure, the income flow that I possess as, an elite, as you were describing, the divide between sort of the elites and the hoi polloi.
I think you're absolutely right. I don't disagree with that for 1 second. I don't know when Shelby Steele wrote the words that you've just read out, but I think the events that we've seen unfold since October the 7th really go to prove the point that he's making there, and kind of also prove that this is evil on a scale like we haven't seen, since the time of the Second World War unfurling, I think. Certainly in London, in the UK, we see every week since the 7th of October these, well, I call them pro-Hamas marches. These are people taking to the streets to essentially defend the brutality of a terrorist organization. And they are doing this in the guise of kind of anti-racism. Woke politics is allowing them to take on this moral high ground, where people are racialized to such an extent that Jewish people, under this kind of identity politics intersectional framework that they've constructed, are seen as kind of hyper white, privileged. It's pure stereotyping, and therefore can be quite legitimately subjected to the most outrageous evil and abuse without qualms. I think the whole kind of Claudine Gay scandal and the Ivy League presidents and their willingness to turn a blind eye to even calls for genocide really exposes the complete evil that lies behind the seemingly nice rhetoric of equity, diversity, and inclusion.
You were on a college campus for a time, University of Kent, as I mentioned at the outset. I wonder if you saw where we are today coming a generation or two ago. If there's something that you saw on campus to say this is starting to take us down a dark path, or because a lot of people who are similarly situated to you, academics, peaceful pluralists, thoughtful people, they sort of were a fish that didn't know they were in water. They sort of didn't see it coming. And so I just wonder, were there watershed moments in your mind where we're starting to really accelerate down the path we're on now?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. I left academia, I suppose, fairly recently. It was back in 2017, 2018. So my experiences are fairly new. But I think easily a decade before that, you could see current trends absolutely bedded in already. For me, the first signs of this were the growing intolerance towards free speech, the growing tendency for students, and I have to say 100% backed by many academics, even at that point, to seek to ban anything that they found offensive. And the definition of what they found offensive expanded year on year. So this was anything from pop songs to newspapers to obviously outside speakers. The first response was just to ban it. And it really struck me as a very authoritarian move and a real hostility to thought, ideas, anything that they found offensive. One very clear example of this that was already well in place, like I say, at least 15 years ago, that has very serious repercussions for what's going on today, was the emergence of the BDS movement on campus, boycott, divestment and sanctions, specifically targeted against Israel. Now, this was, like I said, well underway over a decade ago. So you had this singling out of Israel against a backdrop of increased racialization on campus and increased kind of calls for positive discrimination in terms of assessment, admissions procedures for certain other ethnic groups. So you already were creating the climate where these double standards, where one group was seen as being beyond reproach, couldn't even be kind of, we couldn't listen to what they had to say, and another group deserved special privileges and special status. This is certainly 15 years in my own experience, but I think actually extends back further than that too.
How much do you think welfare states in the West, the Western societies, the Western countries, contributed to the entitlement mentality that began to metastasize in terms of, first racial and then gender identity? Because, we've seen this explode. I mean, there's a couple things we know. One, that there's a strong correlation between being a state dependent and being a supporter of big government left-wing political parties. So that creates a loyal constituency. And you don't need to be Cloward or Piven to theorize what happens when you see something work. The government grows, dependency grows, the entitlement mentality grows, and people look over and see what their neighbor has and how they're getting it. and they follow suit or seek to even come over the top with more entitlements based on, as you were talking about, intersectionality, a combination of victim identities. So that, something that is secular in a sense, the state and the welfare state being an accelerant to the identity politics and expanding identity politics outside the campus.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very interesting interplay between these two things that you've identified there. I think for me, I guess the way I see this as playing out most clearly in the UK is that we've got the creation of kind of two distinct classes, with a lot of people in the middle, but at the top end, as I've already noted, a kind of professional managerial class who is managing the implementation of woke ideology throughout the institutions. But at the other end of that spectrum, you have the creation of well, as you say, a kind of a dependent class, but I think they're marked out not just by kind of financial dependence upon the state, but a kind of nurtured or created sense of vulnerability. And I think this really accelerated over the course of lockdowns in the UK and the way that we responded to the pandemic, where you create a kind of class of people who were almost outside of society, but not in a traditional economic underclass kind of way, but a class of society who have come to perceive of themselves as not just physically ill, but kind of mentally ill. And again, not mental illness in the way that it might have been traditionally understood, but almost mentally vulnerable. That they're
traumatized.
Sorry.
Traumatized.
Yeah, absolutely. Mentally traumatized, mentally too vulnerable to be able to do the routine things of going out and working a 9 to 5. And I think where these two classes interplay, where it becomes so insidious, is that you can't have a managerial elite unless they've got people to manage. And so you create this group at the bottom who become the kind of pawns, if you like, become the group that is managed and becomes dependent upon then this managerial class. And you create this symbiotic relationship where the two are heavily dependent upon the other, and there's no incentive for either to change society the way it is. But I think there's another whole group of people, kind of regular folk, if you like, trapped in the middle, sandwiched between these two classes, who are the people who are going to work, producing the things, keeping the economy ticking over. And I think it's kind of us people, if you like, in the middle of all this, who are really paying the heavy price, out of our taxes. We're supporting a vulnerable, dependent group on the one hand, but we're also supporting an incredibly parasitic managerial class that doesn't actually produce anything, doesn't contribute anything positive to the economy, simply manages the rest of society.
Right. I mean, it's almost sort of a Stockholm syndrome dynamic with lower income individuals that are dependents on the state, identifying with people who really don't have any particular allegiance to them or even interest in them, but they'll pay off what they need to pay off in order to maintain this sort of equilibrium that benefits them. And so I guess my question is, how do you break that cycle or that symbiotic relationship? Do you do it through economic policy? Is it take a sort of a deprogramming? There needs to be some sort of cultural or psychological break from this unhealthy relationship, the Stockholm syndrome, as I sort of use as the handle. So is it a cultural, moral case that you make, or is it economic incentives that you change, or both?
Yeah, again, it's a really good question, and unfortunately, I don't think the answer is straightforward or simple. For me, these are primarily political and cultural questions, and I think that for all the I described a kind of symbiotic relationship between a dependent class and a managerial class. I think, exactly as you say, we shouldn't be under any illusion that the managerial class are in a positive relationship with this dependent class. They are, like I said, parasitic. They want their votes and they want them to be able to manage them and to be seen to be playing a kind of morally worthy role in society. But they're actually very contemptuous of the lifestyle and culture of the vast majority of people in society. I mean, in the UK, over recent years, this has taken its clearest form in the discussion around Brexit. One of the reasons why I ultimately left academia, around 2017, 2018, was I was the only Brexit voter, the only Leave voter, certainly who I really knew of at the time, on my university, and the hostility was incredible. It exposed a real divide in society where there was a very strong steer that if you were a kind of a right-thinking, a good person, you did not back Brexit. And there was a strong correlation with class and Brexit. And I think that was one way in which working class people really made their voices heard. We see it playing out much more today over discussions around immigration. We've got absolutely record high levels of immigration in the UK right now, both legal and illegal immigration. And this, again, you see a massive class divide. The people who are managing immigration, the people who are pushing for high levels of immigration, you often find that they live in nice parts of cities where immigrants rarely appear, other than, the nanny who's going to help look after the children, or the electrician or decorator who's going to help maintain the house. Whereas it's working class people who are more at the bottom of the economic pecking order, who not only have their wages artificially deflated, not only have their jobs put at risk, because cheaper people come in and take the work from them, but actually find that it's their culture and their communities and their neighbourhoods that are most at the forefront of change as well. And I think, again, that just shows kind of the moral contempt, or the disregard, if you like, that the managerial class has for people who are more at the bottom of society. And I actually think pointing that out and making those political and cultural arguments appeals to people's sense of self-respect in a way that financial handouts don't. Yes, you can take the financial handouts, but ultimately what you're paying for, even if you don't earn any money yourself, even if you're entirely dependent upon the state, it's your culture, it's your way of life, it's what you believe in, it's the future you want for your children that's at stake here. And making those political arguments, I do think, does touch a nerve with people. And for me, that's really the way to go in pushing back and changing things.
Making the arguments within your circles of influence, I agree with, but are there other things that you think would be productive in terms of commonsensical people who are being fleeced by a system they finance, as you were describing, to stoke the revolt? Common sense things they can do to stoke the revolt. Let me give you an example. You're talking about migration and the problem. Obviously, as you know, we have a similar problem to Britain, actually, a massive problem at our southern border, because we have a political class that essentially favors de facto open border policies. And so we've got governors in the South, like Greg Abbott in Texas, sending migrants that enter the border into Texas to sanctuary states and sanctuary cities like Illinois and Chicago, like New York City and New York State, and so forth. And all of a sudden, those people with the "hate has no home here" signs in their yards, and they were pro-sanctuary city, don't help, don't work with ICE, whoever wants, no person is illegal, whoever wants to come can come whenever they want on their own terms and do what they want. Well, now they don't like them when you have buses dropping off migrants in their wealthy enclaves around Chicagoland, for example, which I know, an area I know well. And so the response, for example, would be not just, complain on talk radio or write a letter to the editor, but actually, your neighbors in this enclave, who's who, you know who had the signs in their yards and windows and who didn't. So what about literally giving addresses to migrants as they are dropped off to say, this is a person who will help you? What about taking a migrant from, well, it could be, I mean, here, it could be Russia, it could be China, it could be Latin or South America, it could be for a lot of places, taking them over and introducing them to your hate has no home here sign neighbor and saying, won't you take my friend Vlad here in for the weekend or something? I mean, really in your face, not in a violent way, obviously, but in a way that says, I'm calling you out. You're not going to get away with this anymore. And so maybe it's time for you to consider how you behave vis-a-vis me, because I'm going to use sort of the shame tool the way that you've been using it rhetorically against me. What do you think?
I have no problem with that at all. I would be quite happy to see people do that, and why not? I suspect, though, it's not a big enough solution to what we're looking for here to really bring about change. I think ultimately, for me, that does still come at the ballot box. And, I think both Britain and the US this year are facing elections. I suspect you'll have a lot more interesting a ride of it in the States. I suspect in the UK we are very, very likely, it seems, to have a Labour government inflicted upon us, which will no doubt bring a lot more divisive identitarianism, a lot more woke ideology with it. But my hope, and I suspect the Conservative Party that's currently in office will be absolutely trounced. I'm expecting them to lose, and I hope they do lose very, very badly, because even though they've carried the label Conservative Party, they've not been a Conservative Party in practice. It's been on their watch that so many of these institutions have properly gone woke, right from the civil service down. So I hope they do get absolutely thrashed. My guess is the Labour Party won't last more than one term. And, at risk of kind of looking a bit too far into the future and being a bit too hopeful, I would like to see the destruction of both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in the UK, because I think it's only at that point that we're going to have space for new parties to emerge, new political ideas. And that's what we desperately need. We need some new, dare I say it from a US perspective, younger political blood, but some fresh political thinking. I think we're caught up in a system where we're really hemmed in by the political structures from last century, when people's ideas and lives and thinking have kind of moved on, and the parties we've got don't represent where people are at right now. And I think we need some space for new political parties and ideas to be born. And I think the kind of argument that you're suggesting about, go around to your neighbours, to me, that would be a really great first step in kind of allowing these debates and kind of sparking some of the disputes that we need to happen to allow these new parties ultimately to take root.
So in the UK, I know Rishi Sunak has been a disaster, and they've essentially sold out their constituency, and so they deserve to be beaten, as you say. But what you're telling me, which is interesting because I think it's the same dynamic in the US, is that revolt that led to Brexit is still very much alive in the UK. It just doesn't have a place to call home formally at this point. Is that and I think we see that in other Western European countries too, with whether it's Dutch farmers or Yellow Jackets in France too. It's there below the surface, but the sort of 20th century parties don't have the bandwidth to really give it form. They have the bandwidth to bring them in temporarily with promises, but then we still have a bit of an implementation problem in most places.
Absolutely, 100%. I really, really agree with that. I mean, the tragedy for the past 4 years in the UK is that things could have been very, very different. Back in 2019, we elected Boris Johnson as leader of the Conservative Party. He had a huge majority, and he had unprecedented votes from within the working class, people who've never ever voted Conservative before in their lives. And the entire thing was squandered, for two reasons. I mean, obviously there were practical real world events, COVID, the pandemic, that had to be dealt with. But also Boris Johnson, I think he was a bit of a fraud, really. He spoke the language of get Brexit done. He had some good instincts, but certainly in terms of immigration, for example, he was the one who oversaw. I think he, as you mentioned earlier, he's one of these people who massively believes in open borders, it seems, and he was talking to people about Brexit and the importance of national sovereignty, all the while overseeing a regime of higher levels of illegal migration than the country has ever known. I think at heart he was actually quite woke by instinct, or liberal, let's say, by instinct. Since Boris Johnson was effectively ousted, we had a month of Liz Truss, and since then we've really had the revenge of the technocrats. With Rishi Sunak, he's even brought back a former Conservative Prime Minister into his cabinet. These people are kind of rubbing their hands with glee, thinking that they've reclaimed the day. But I think you're absolutely right. I think beneath the surface, the one thing I hear more often than anything else, people say to me is, oh, I'm politically homeless. That sense of just not having any political party that really represents them. And I think that creates a bit of an opportunity, because it means as soon as, a voice or a party can come along that really does speak on behalf of this kind of silent majority, I think they'd really sweep up.
Yeah, the great Austrian economist von Mises, Ludwig von Mises, famously observed that he who wants to improve conditions must propagate a new mentality, not merely a new institution. And I think we think about this in the West, we think about society through institutions, but when these institutions become sclerotic, as they have been, dominated by the new Marxists as they are, then it is that new sort of philosophy about how to organize society. And I know this is some of the work that you're doing at the think tank you started, CO, right? So I wonder, like, how you think about prompting more thinking. I mean, do we need to, sort of take a philosophy 101 course, sort of, in an ad hoc way, and reconceive how society should be ordered? Like, I mean, not that I'm necessarily a fan, but I mean, go like John Rawls' original position. Think about if you'd have no idea where you're going to be. I mean, for our viewers who are unfamiliar, you have no idea where you're going to fall in society. So now think about the benefits and responsibilities that will be distributed among all in society, and you don't know where you're going to be, what skin color, what religion, gender, sex, and all this stuff. So you should be probably risk averse in terms of how much you want to grab at the expense of everybody else. And the idea, it's perhaps a bit flawed, but the idea of philosophy, the thought exercise is, so think about universal goods that can be enjoyed by all simultaneously that come with proportional responsibilities. And maybe that's the sort of conversation we have to try to force to get people thinking a little bit, as opposed to just playing sort of cult of personality politics, which of course we do in the West, we do in America as bad as anybody in the West.
I mean, I would be all in favor of people doing kind of philosophy 101. I'm there for that. I think that sounds like a great suggestion. But I think the truth is, that's not going to be for everyone. I think one thing that makes me quite optimistic, or stops me falling into a complete pit of despair, I think one thing that has changed quite considerably over the past 5 years is the media landscape. Suddenly within the UK, I think if we go back to the last election, we really had very few television channels that were very dominant, and a few newspapers, that this obviously comprised the mainstream media. I think 5 years on, this is very, very different. Not only have we got new news channels that have sprung up, GB News is one that comes to my mind, but we've got far more independent publishing outlets. You mentioned the online publication I write for, Spiked, my own think tank, but also through Substack. And it seems to me that through the online world, it takes a lot of knocking, and I think there's all kinds of problems with social media and the way we use the internet. But I do think it creates this huge possibility for widening the debate. I mean, the very fact that I'm, sitting here in the UK having this conversation with you now, I think is really a very exciting prospect. And, if you think back to exciting times in history and think how they might have even been different if people had had the mechanisms for communication we've got nowadays, to really be able to proliferate ideas. I think Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter has undoubtedly been a very good thing for promoting free speech. I'd like to see him have the guts to go even further with that. But I think all of those kind of mechanisms for promoting free speech, promoting debate, really help get people talking. And, Philosophy 101, I would love that. I think that would be brilliant. But I think almost you can recognize that that's not going to be for everyone, but there are other ways of bringing people into debates and propagating kind of ideas as well.
What kind of threat do you think the sort of current cultural dominance of the woke left, what kind of threat does it present? I mean, can we peacefully coexist with people who want to confer benefits and impose responsibilities based on race or gender identity? Can you have a free society and also have that be a feature of that? Because if you can't, what happens if the woke are able to essentially completely marginalize those who disagree with them? What does that look like?
Yeah, no, it's quite terrifying. I mean, I have to say, ultimately, I come down on the side of this not being possible. I don't think we can peacefully coexist. And I know that's quite a controversial thing to say. But I think the way I see it, woke ideology is so incredibly divisive. To categorize people according to race, according to gender, it's an attack on women's rights. It's an attack on what I would see as genuine colorblind racial equity. It's about labeling people, putting people in boxes and getting people to see what divides them rather than what they have in common. And I think whilst those ideas are dominant, you cannot I cannot peacefully coexist with those ideas. I want to, I think challenging, not just challenging almost, but removing from post the people who hold those ideas is necessary for the peaceful future of society. And, hopefully that can be done fairly painlessly. Hopefully it can be done by either setting up new institutions or changing existing institutions from within. But I think we would be naive to think that we can just kind of peacefully coexist. I think we're also naive to think that transforming society is a straightforward and an easy task. We, in order to push back against woke thinking, and I think we must for all the reasons I've just said, but I think we have to recognize that is one hell of a task we have on our hands. This is hard work. It's politically, mentally, emotionally, a very, very hard job that we're faced with if we want to not just challenge woke ideology for the sake of it, but to actually return society to a state where rationality, reason, really important principles are at the fore of society. I think we really have a big fight on our hands, but for a peaceful society, this is absolutely vital.
Joanna Williams is the author of How Woke Won. She's also the founder of the CO think tank and an editor for Spiked Online. Joanna, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your insights and commentary. Appreciate your time.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.